Does your art need to say something? Does it need to have a meaning behind it? An idea that it is trying to bring into existence with each pen stroke or stroke of the brush across the page? I don't know, but I think that you can easily bisect this question into two sub-questions. Does your art always contain something? Does it always contain some meaning because it was made by a human? And then the second would be, should you be putting meaning into your work? Does it need to have some in order to exist in the first place? Let's go ahead and dissect the second point first, because I think that that's probably going to be a little bit more widely applicable. And then we can deal with the weird ethereal concept of, is meaning imparted because it's done by a human, at a later point in this sketchbook session. Welcome to the session, by the way. My name is Zach, and if you enjoy these kinds of artistic rambles, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. We do these every single week, and I am happy to talk about random things that you throw in the comments as well. So, does your art need to have a purpose, a meaning, a theme, a moral that it is trying to get across? I would say right off the bat, no. That is not necessary for it to be art in some broad, weirdly defined sense of the word. Nor do I think that if it does not have that element, does it become worse art. Forcing anything into your artwork generally seems like a bad idea. I taught middle and high school art for 11 years, and in that time, there were many instances of me kind of in my youthful naivety trying to force students to impart something greater into their artwork. Now, that sounds worse than it is. It was not usually me lording things over them, but it was more like, this is the assignment and this is the express goal and purpose of the assignment, and if you sidestep that, you're kind of missing the point. This was more akin to a student writing an essay about a particular book, like that was the assignment, and they wanted to write it about something different, where, that paper and that idea, the concept that you're bringing forward is not bad, but it's just not quite fulfilling the assignment that is before you. And I realized over time that the way that I was going about this was just not going to get the kind of results that I wanted. I was trying to get the students to learn particular things, obviously. Usually this was skill-based, but sometimes, especially in the earlier years, I was trying to focus on specific moral, ethical, or cultural concerns that were coming from the artwork that we were studying. As we were studying modern American art, or if we were studying expressionism or impressionism, those art forms were responses to things that were happening in the world at that point in time. And so it made sense to a younger me, and I think it still does in a greater way, to have students try to figure out how they can embody certain components of that in their own artwork to learn the art history and the art historical components. What I learned over time, though, was the students generally disliked their work more if they forcibly inserted things into it. And this started with the realization that if they forcibly inserted something from the assignment into it, they didn't like it. That I wrapped my head around pretty quickly, and I adjusted. Again, this was probably me teaching at about 25 or 26. I'm 37 now, so you learn things in your youth from failures. But as I got older and my approach to teaching was far more refined, I noticed that students would do this to themselves sometimes. Sometimes they would make a beautiful painting, and then they would have this weird thought process, usually from critique or from talking to their parents, and they'd come back to the work and go, oh, this piece, it doesn't have a purpose to it. I talked to my mom, and my mom thought it was really strange that my piece doesn't have a deeper meaning. And in talking to the students and talking through these things, I realized that if they tried to impart meaning where there wasn't the purpose to have that meaning initially, where they didn't have any desire to have it, that it didn't necessarily make the work worse, but it almost always made the student like the work less. And I think that's important because it's so easy for us to dislike pieces of our artwork. Artwork is so tremendously personal. And when we try to impart things into it that were not part of the original intent, I think that it automatically strays from what we were intending. So when you have a piece of artwork and you are trying to forcibly make it get some point across. Seems like that almost always makes the piece of work worse in the artist's eyes. Now, this is different than if you go into the piece and you decide that you have something you want to represent. In this particular drawing right now, for example, I don't have anything I'm trying to represent. I'm just doing a little robot guy. It's fine. It's fun. However, the next one that I'm going to start in a few minutes was actually dealing with some of like the sadness and feeling overwhelmed that I felt recently. And so the robot has a purpose. And if I felt like this purpose was imposed, like I was trying to force it on the design, I don't think I'd be happy with it. But because the overarching purpose of the drawing was to encapsulate sadness in this little robotic form, it feels fine to me. I'm happy with the result because of the way that it comes across. So, does your artwork need to have a deeper meaning? Does it need to have some moral or ethic or principle behind it? I really don't think so. I think this is really apparent when you look at non-representational and abstract art for certain. But also, like, there's a lot of joy in just sitting in your backyard and like painting a flower. It doesn't need to be something that is tied into the beauty of nature or an exploration of colors and what these colors mean. There's nothing wrong with that kind of art for sure. And for some people, that's very, very therapeutic and they find that to be really beautiful. But I think that if you feel like that's what art is supposed to be, and you try to impose that on your own artwork, or if somebody else forces that onto you, it seems like it generally makes the work worse in the artist's eye. And the reason I'm stating it that way is that sometimes it actually does seem better to people on the outside. So you kind of have to think about what the purpose of your artwork is. If the purpose of your artwork is to be something for yourself, something that brings you joy and happiness and you enjoy the process of making it, then it doesn't matter if somebody else likes it or not. You just keep going. If you're doing a piece of work for a client, for a commission of some kind or something, then you probably want to make sure you're making them happy. But I think that's pretty understandable. Like, that seems reasonable, something that most people will wrap their head around pretty quickly. So no, I don't think that your artwork needs to say anything. I don't think your artwork needs to have some greater meaning or purpose. Sometimes a flower is just a flower and that's fun. Sometimes a robot's just a robot and that's fun. The second part of this question, though, I think is far more interesting. Does all artwork in some way, as being a product of human hands and human mind, have meaning in it? This is going to be much harder to come to a definitive answer on, but I think that it probably does, and I'll kind of unpack that a little bit as I ramble here for the next few minutes. I think that in most cases, not all cases, if you're sitting down and you're just practicing boxes, I don't think that there's some deeper psychological meaning that is imparted into those necessarily. But when you allow your mind to just make things, if you have a proficient enough set of skills, you've drawn a lot, you've painted a lot, you've sculpted a lot, and you have moments like I do right now where you're just drawing something, you don't really have a whole lot of intention and you're just going to let your subconscious go, I do think there usually is something else in there. And this is one of the most beautiful things. This is almost like poetry in artwork. Poems are historically a very strange thing. I'm approaching this as I'm talking about it. I'm thinking of it from a teaching angle because that's where I spent most of my professional career. I have a really good friend who is a poet and a literature teacher, and he gets all kinds of funny kickback from students and sometimes even parents or other teachers when he teaches poetry units. And it's this idea that poems don't mean anything, or that they're so open to interpretation that it's all just kind of BS. It's really frustrating to him because he's a really empathetic man and he really loves and understands humans in a way that I kind of look up to. I think about him and I look at how he has dealt with some things in his life and I go, I need to be a little bit more like this guy. He's so innately, naturally kind and understanding of other people. So he gets frustrated by this kind of comment because the fact that a poem can be read so many different ways should not lead us to think that it has no definitive meaning, that because its meaning might be more subjective, that it is by its nature purposeless. Because it has subjective meaning, it therefore does not have objective value. And I think that's just a misnomer. I think it's a different form of art. And if you write a song and this song is about something specific, then there is an intention for you as the artist to impart to the listener. But most musicians are not upset if somebody else imparts their own meaning onto it as well. This kind of drawing is more like that, more like poetry. It's something where the artist is letting their mind put things down, maybe with some purpose, maybe without, and the viewer, in this case, is pulling out their own meaning. Does that mean that their meaning is more or less valuable than the meaning that the artist intended? No. Does that mean if they find meaning in it that the artist did not intend, that that's not valid? No. This almost gets into like death of the author kind of idea, this concept that after the author puts their work down, that it's up to the readers or the listeners to interpret it. I don't necessarily cling to that idea very much. I have a tendency as a writer, as an artist, to believe that the artist does get to determine what their work is about. But you can't dismiss the fact that humans who are interpreting that and imbibing of those forms of art, they also have their own interpretations, and they're not invalid because they're different than what the artist intended. I think that might be a fun thing to talk about at another point. So if you want me to ramble about death of the author at some point from an artistic sense, let me know in the comments below. I will have to do a little research, but that might be kind of fun. I love research. So I think these kinds of drawings and drawings in general, paintings in general, artwork in general, tends to, if allowed, contain some deeper meaning from the artist's subconscious. I don't think of this in a weird, kind of ethereal, spiritual way, as much as I think that many of us can't help but impart our values, our beliefs, the things that we're thinking about, dealing with, the traumas in our life into the artwork that we develop. I think this is just a very natural thing for us as humans. Some people do it more than others. Some people do it less. Some people do it always intentionally. Some people do it never intentionally. But I think that there is a certain level of meaning often, not always, but often imparted into artwork, regardless of the artist's intent. And so, like I mentioned, if you're looking at this second robot come into being here, like there's obviously more emotion there. It has a purpose. This is a really sad or depressed or weeping little creature. And it, might make you uncomfortable. It made me uncomfortable for parts of it because it's like his mouth is leaky and that's kind of creepy and strange and I don't like icky things. But at the same time, like it was kind of therapeutic for me to work through it. This was intentional for me. I was trying to get something across. And actually talking about this second point, perhaps we should be looking at the robot on the left and trying to figure out if there's some hidden meaning there. But that's not really for me to decide. For me, that was just a fun little drawing that I put together. And then the one on the right has more distinct purpose. It has meaning. So I'm curious what you think, though. This is something that the more time you spend around art, the more you might be conscious of, or at least aware of the discussion surrounding this. But I am curious what you think. Does art always have a meaning, some kind of greater purpose to it simply because it was made by a human and humans have the ability to do that? And should you put meaning into your work? Is it okay just to have work that means nothing? I'm just curious to know what y'all think. So if you don't mind leaving that in the comments below for me and for other people to see, that would be lovely. Well, as always, thank you for your time. And thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support. If you want to help determine what happens in these podcasts and sketchbook sessions, you can join the Patreon below. Any support would be wonderful. Just like the time you've dedicated to watching this and the comments that you leave below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.